Good morning, everybody. My name is Ian. I'm the executive pastor here at Epicenter. Pastor Mark is he's continuing his mini sabbatical, but he'll be back very, very soon. He's looking forward. I got to talk to him some this week. He's looking forward to being back with you guys and, sharing God's word with all of you. But in the meantime, we're going to continue our series, My Hero. This is week 5. I get the privilege of sharing the message with you guys today. Excuse me. And, anytime Pastor Mark trusts me to stand on the stage and deliver God's word to you, I'm always honored. But today, it's kind of extra cool that I get to be part of a series that so many others have already been part of and will be part of. And so if you aren't familiar with this series, we started 5 weeks ago, and we are looking at different figures, biblical figures who are mentioned in the chapter of Hebrews 11, often called the Hall of Faith chapter. All right, so before we kind of reveal which biblical figure we'll be hanging out with today, I wanted to kind of revisit the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11 and kind of remind ourselves how it got the nickname, the Hall of Faith. So turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 1, and it says in the NIV, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." So this quick, simple definition of faith, the author of Hebrews, after this quick definition of faith, the author of Hebrews spends almost 30 verses listing off things that various biblical figures did by faith. All right? And so as you take your seats this morning, I want to kind of look a little more closely at what all of this means, right? Many of us, if I was to say, hey, what is faith? Most of us probably would give a definition that has something to do with belief, right? What we think or know is true about God and the world. And the author of Hebrews, those things, what we believe or know is true about God, that is absolutely an essential part of belief. But the author of Hebrews is pretty clear throughout chapter 11 that faith goes deeper than simply belief or mental assent. Right? The NIV says that faith is not just belief, but the ability to have confidence in what we hope for and feel assured about what we cannot see. Professor N.T. Wright, in his translation, The New Testament for Everyone, puts the same verse like this. He writes, "What then is faith? It is what gives assurance to our hopes. It is what gives us conviction about things we can't see." And then the Message translation says that the fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is the firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see. So faith is a little more than saying, I believe in God, right? It is the act of living as though what God has revealed about himself is true. It is our confidence, our assurance, our firm foundation. It is what gives us conviction to act, to trust, to live boldly and unafraid. It is a declaration of allegiance to God and his kingdom over anything and everything else. The author of Hebrews is clear that faith and things done by faith was what set the people mentioned in chapter 11 apart from others. And so that got me wondering, what does it mean to do something by faith? Right? And I think the answer to that question is doing something by faith is anything that we wouldn't or couldn't do if we didn't have faith and trust in God. Right? I think the author of Hebrews, if you kind of skim and scan through the first several verses of Hebrews 11, we see in some of the examples that the author provides exactly the point they're making. Abel brought his best to God by faith because of his commitment to him. Right? Noah built a boat in the middle of dry land by faith because he had confidence that God's promise would come true. Abraham left behind everything he had ever known by faith because he trusted that God would lead him somewhere better. Moses stepped out of his comfort zone and into leadership over the people of Israel by faith because he knew that God would fill in the gaps and be strong in his weakness. And Moses led the people of Israel to step into the Red Sea by faith because he was assured by God that the waters would part. The author of Hebrews gives us example after example of these biblical figures not only believing in God, but taking action because of that belief. And so then that got me wondering, what are we doing by faith? right? What kinds of actions are we taking that we wouldn't or couldn't if we didn't have confidence in God as our firm foundation? What kinds of risks or sacrifices or displays of trust are setting us apart because of our assurance that what we hope for will come to pass? And I don't want you to mishear me. I'm not up here saying that anybody should go home today and build a giant boat in your backyard or try to sacrifice your firstborn son and say, hey, look, I'm doing this by faith. I honestly would probably advise against those things, okay? But I want you to understand, right, that doing things, living by faith is more than believing that God is real. It's doing things because of what we believe. And doing things by faith isn't always these big and grandiose gestures that are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Sometimes we can show up and volunteer at church by faith. Sometimes we can give by faith. We can worship by faith because it's something we wouldn't otherwise do if we had not placed our trust in God. Sometimes, we might get a little crazy and we might move 26 hours from El Paso to Fayetteville, North Carolina by faith because we believe that God has called us to come and be the youth pastor at the greatest church in the world. All right, that's Joseph, not me. He said 26 miles last week and we've been ragging on him all week long. All right, sometimes by faith, man, I can't tell you what doing something by faith looks like for you because I'm not you. I'm not in your head and in your heart, and my relationship with God is not your relationship with God. But you know what by faith looks like, right? You know the things that you are doing by faith. And so that's kind of the question that I want us to ask together. And I also want to challenge ourselves because sometimes by faith might look a little different than what we might expect or the way that we would define it. And so I have, really, really creatively titled today's message, By Faith. I mean, none of y'all could have thought of that title. That's just a good title right there. All right, I'm kidding. Living by faith, though, it's like we said, it's more than believing that God is real. It's doing something about or because of that belief. And so I want us to dive a little deeper into what that might look like in our lives. And the way I want us to do that is by examining one of the biblical figures mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. And at first glance, many of you guys know the story, but at first glance, it may not seem like this person has done all that much by faith. It's like, I don't really see it. But as we kind of dig a little deeper and look at the context, we're going to see that, whoa, there were some really big risks taken there. Some really big things that were done by faith. So I believe we can learn a lot from her about what it means to live by faith. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. It says this: by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So Rahab, her appearance in the Hall of Faith is really unique for a variety of reasons. First, she's one of only 2 women out of the 16 people who are mentioned by name in the Hall of Faith. She's one of only 2 women. Second, she's the only Gentile or non-Israelite mentioned. Third, she's the only figure mentioned in conjunction with some sort of label or descriptor. Before anything else, she's referred to as the prostitute Rahab. And then finally, she's the only one whose example of by faith was something that did not happen. Throughout the rest of it, by faith, this person stepped out and did this, or by faith, this was done for this person. But in her example, it's, hey, by faith, she was not killed with with those who were disobedient. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in a few minutes. But obviously we can see just from the jump that Rahab stands out among the residents of the Hall of Faith, so much so that some might even try to argue that maybe she doesn't belong. But I believe that if we look a little closer at what the Bible reveals to us about her story, then we're going to see that many of us will be able to identify with her more than maybe any of the other figures mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. And so Joshua chapter 2 is going to be our main narrative for the rest of our time together this morning. And many of you have heard the story of Rahab dozens, if not hundreds of times. And maybe some of you, you've never heard it before. You're like, what are we about to get into right now? But wherever you're at, I want to kind of challenge you this morning to read and hear this story with me with a fresh perspective, because we're going to look at some of the context that was true about the specific situation where Rahab found herself. So we're going to start right here in Joshua chapter 2. Beginning in verse 1. It says, then Joshua son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from that place. Miss Ginger, if you're in here again, I left my pronunciation paper in my, that you gave me. I left it on my desk. I apologize. I told him the first service, like, I'm not going to try and pronounce that word in church. And she was so gracious to bring me a phonetic pronunciation for the word. But I left it on my desk. So anyways, Joshua sends these 2 spies from that place. And he says, go, look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. So Joshua is following in the tradition of Moses before him. He sends some spies to the land that God has already promised that they will be given. And the first thing that the spies do when they get there is they enter the house of a prostitute. And throughout history of biblical commentary and translation, there have been people who have tried to sanitize the story of Rahab. Right? They've tried to explain away that, oh, no, she was an innkeeper or a business owner, because some people view the fact that she was a prostitute as too scandalous. Like, how God would never include such a person in this story. But no matter how you try, you can't rewrite history or change what the Hebrew text says, right? She was a prostitute. She was a sex worker, plain and simple. And there's 2 main reasons, 2 main theories among scholars and theologians as to why the spies immediately went to the house of the prostitute. The one theory is that it was like some really strategic planning, right? That like, oh, we're out of towners, we don't want to stand out. We're gonna go to the place where we would be the least suspicious in this whole area to kind of acclimate ourselves. So that's the one theory. The other theory is that they entered for the same reason that every other man had entered before them. We'll leave that there. And you're gonna be like, man, why are you even talking about this? Why does that? I'm gonna tell you why it matters. Okay? Because whichever theory you subscribe to, the author of the book of Joshua is doing something very intentional here. The author is trying to get the readers, the original audience, on edge, to get them asking the same questions that we did. Why did they go there? You know, the author is, this is our introduction, right, to Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute of Jericho. And the author of the book of Joshua is trying to get their readers to kind of clutch their pearls a little bit. Like, oh my, what are we about to read? And that's our introduction, right? We still got 20-something verses left. And the thing about Rahab is that she has some things from the very beginning, from the moment that we meet her. She's got some things working against her, both as a figure in a biblical narrative and as a person just existing at a point in history. Okay, the first thing that she has working against her is she's a woman in a patriarchal society, right? Which means that she would be considered at best a second-class citizen and at worst someone's property to be bought, sold, and used as they saw fit. Second, she's a Canaanite. She's a member of a nation on whom God has passed divine judgment and declared that the people of Israel would take possession of their land because of the Canaanites' consistent refusal to turn from their wicked, unjust, and oppressive ways. And then third, she's a prostitute, a low-ranking class in Canaanite society and an immoral outcast in the eyes of the Israelites. She is in many ways everything that the original audience, and honestly, probably some of us, would have looked down on and discussed. She's powerless, godless, unclean, and immoral. See, one of the reasons that I love the story of Rahab so much is because as we continue reading her story, we're going to see throughout this narrative that God can see past our scandal and into our hearts. Right? God can see past our mess and see the worth and the value that is inherent in every single person created in the image of God. And I think sometimes as Christians, we're a little too quick to clutch our pearls and write somebody off and say, oh, I can't be around that. That's too, we may not use these words. That's too scandalous for me. I can't be seen hanging out. Man, who you think Jesus hung out with the majority of the time that he was on earth? I'm trying to preach a different message. Let's move on. Okay, so the author of Jericho is trying to kind of get us on edge a little bit. She's kind of like make us a little uncomfortable. And then the spies are in Rahab's house when we see verses 2 and 3. It says, the king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. So at this point, whatever the reason that the spies went to Rahab's house first, they didn't get much spying done before they were discovered. Okay, some scholars believe that Rahab may have been a trusted source of information for the king of Jericho and his men. Due to the varied demographics of her clientele, right? People coming and going from different regions and areas, they can garner a lot of information from her. And so with this in mind, the author of Joshua is doing something very intentional that if we've read this story 15, 20, 100 times, we just know what's coming next and we might miss this, right? The author of Joshua he's introduced us to Rahab, this scandalous, immoral woman, where the spies of Israel are kind of, we don't really know why they're there, but now here comes the king of Jericho's men and they're saying, hey, hand them over. Every single member of the original audience would have expected that the very next thing that Rahab does is say, here they are. The reason for that is because that's what every single member of the original audience would have done. Here they are, right? For a lot of us, if we try to get past knowing how the story ends, that's how a lot of us might go. Like if some random dude showed up at my house and the police come knocking at the door for them 5 minutes later, you think I'm covering for them? It's like, here they are. So that's the expectation of all of the readers of the original audience, right? Because they know that Rahab's going to turn in these spies, whether it's out of loyalty to her king or her city-state, or whether it's just out of her desire to preserve her life and livelihood. What's going to happen next is the spies are going to get God. And when we can read this story from the lens of the original audience, verse 4 becomes almost shocking when it says, but the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. I'm just going to pause right there. I didn't do this in the first service. Again, for us who know this story, we're like, yeah, okay, that's what happens next. This lady risked her life. She committed an act of political treason to hide these two Israelite spies that she'd never met before because they came from a people who served a God that she'd heard about. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I don't want you to miss how big of a risk, how big of an act of faith it was for her to hide these men. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up to them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. So that's what she does. She defies expectations and commits an act of treason. She risks her own life in the process. If it was ever discovered that she was hiding enemy spies, she'd be put to death on the spot. Not only did she hide them, she sent the king's men in a completely different direction, buying them time to escape. And that shows in many ways just how deeply ingrained Rahab was in, how trusted she was by the king and his men, because she said, hey, they went that way. And they didn't say, hey, let me come into your house and just check just in case. They go, all right, she said, we're going that way. So this probably wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And yet she chooses to take this huge risk, and she did it all by faith. When Hebrews 11:31 says that Rahab welcomed the spies, this is what is being referenced. She didn't just welcome them simply with the ancient Near Eastern hospitality, which is historically known for going above and beyond to accommodate guests. She didn't just welcome them the way that any prostitute wanting to stay in business would. She did more than welcome them. She rescued them, and she put her life on the line to do so. But she didn't do it for their sake. She did it because she had placed her trust in the God they served. So this act of faith and bravery is why Rahab is mentioned not just in Hebrews chapter 11, but also in the book of James. James 2:24 through 26 says, you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. James brings up Rahab's story as part of a larger argument where he's essentially making the same point as the author of Hebrews. What we do by faith is evidence of our faith. It's not enough to simply believe that God can do something. We have to look for ways that he wants to do something through us and then be ready to act in confidence and as evidence that God is who he says that he is. Sometimes we don't think about this, but when we say we believe in God and then don't act on that, we're giving people evidence that God isn't trustworthy. But on the conversely, when we say that we trust in God and we believe in him and we continue to trust in him even when it doesn't make sense, we are living physical evidence to the people around us that God is worth trusting in. James knows that we're not saved by faith. That we are saved, I read that wrong. We are saved by faith, trust me. James knows that we are saved by faith, not works. I'll say that again because I messed it up the first time. James knows that we are saved by faith, not works. But he also knows that saving faith will always produce works. True faith must be acted on. It must be demonstrated with confidence, conviction, and assurance. You can tell people what you believe, but you have to show them your faith. Think about what we've read so far in the story of Rahab, right? She has not made any grand speeches or spoke eloquently about her faith, but we've witnessed what she believes and where her trust is because we've watched her act on that faith and that trust. She's done something with it. Both James and the author of Hebrews recognize that welcoming and rescuing the spies was an act of bold faith and trust in God. They make it clear that Rahab was not saved by her actions, but by the faith that moved her to take action, because saving faith always results in action. It's not enough to sit on our hands and say, I believe that God can do it. We got to find a way to be part of his plan. But as we continue reading the story of Rahab, we see a confession of faith, of the faith by which she's already acted. It begins in verse 8 where she says, before the spies lay, where she doesn't say this, the author of Joshua says, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So Rahab says that she and all of Jericho have heard the stories of all that God has done through Israel. And again, if we're just kind of reading it casually, we're like, man, that's cool. Rahab believes in God. But if we look a little deeper, we'll realize that the events that she's referencing happened before or during the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Which tells us, right, that the people of Jericho have had 40 years to ponder God's power and turn from their wicked, unjust, and disobedient ways. And yet their only response is to melt in fear and stand in rebellion. The fear, the fact that they are afraid of the God of Israel is proof that Jericho believed that God had the power to overtake their mighty wall. They believed that he had the power, but their response was only to stand in fear and continue in their rebellion. Only Rahab has allowed the belief in God's power to transform into faith and trust in God. A faith that is evident just as much by her actions as by her declaration. Only Rahab out of all of Jericho was willing to trust that the one true God could see past her past and redeem her future. See, something we miss often is the exact same redemption that Rahab received was available to every single citizen of Jericho. They had 40 years to think about it. to ponder it, to contemplate it, to say, man, Israel's God is really big. But Rahab's the only one that said, man, Israel's God is really big. I think I'm going to put my trust in him. How often do we have opportunities to say, man, I believe that God can show up in my situation. But we have to understand that it looks different to say, I believe that God can show up in my situation, to make it say, hey, I trust that God will show up in my situation. I'm living and acting by faith so that if God's not who he says he is, I'm in trouble. Everybody in Jericho believed that the God of Israel was big. Rahab's the only one who said, man, I'm going to put my trust in you. And she doesn't stop there. She takes another risk in verse 12, where she makes a major request. She says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. This is another one where we're missing some context, okay? Because when we read this 4,000 years later, we're like, yeah, fair is fair. She saved you, you saved her. Makes sense to me. But you remember those obstacles we talked about earlier? She's a woman. She's a Canaanite. She's a prostitute. In the eyes of the spies, they're really not under much of an obligation to help her out. Some theologians argue they probably were actually prohibited from making the promise that she was asking. She's taking a huge risk. Because if they say, nah, bro, can't help you, she's in trouble. Because now she's harboring some spies. And even if she was to go back and say, hey, guys, remember how I told you they left? Actually, I lied. They're right here. She's still a goner. All these factors are significant, right? They're playing into the fact that her asking for this is an equal display of faith to hiding the spies in the first place. It's a request that's made by faith because she knows who she is. She knows what she's done and what's been done to her. She knows the names she's been called, her standing in society. She knows the way that other people view her. And in spite of all of that, she dares to express her conviction that the one true God loves even her, that he can save and redeem even her and her household. Church, living by faith doesn't just move us into action. It makes us understand that there is nothing in our story too big for God's grace. It allows us to trust that God's love and saving power are beyond anything we have ever done or ever could do. I'm not saying that living by faith means we have a license to continue in our old ways, but rather it moves us toward repentance because we're confident that God has grace for us no matter where we've been, no matter what we've done, no matter how many pearls the people around us are clutching and say, oh, God has grace for you. You bet he does. I need you to hear this word today. Somebody in this room needs to hear this. You are not what you have done or what you're doing. You are not the labels that others have placed on you or the ones you've put upon yourself. You are not your biggest mistakes and greatest failures. You are more than the sum of your past. Living by faith means being willing to step out from our past and our old way of being to declare, that's not who I am anymore, and I'm convinced that God can change me, save me, transform me from the inside out. We were called to live out the kind of faith that assures us that with God's strength, we can and will be different. The kind of faith that is convinced that even if we've fallen down 100 times, God can and will be there to pick us up for time 101. The kind of faith that is confident that God's love and grace is bigger than our marriage problems, our financial problems, our work problems, our family problems, our regular old problems. The kind of faith that serves as the foundation for everything we do and say. Living by faith means seeing past what others see and say about us and about others and believing that God's grace is for everyone. But Rahab shows us in just these two verses that there's even more to living by faith. Man, we are called to live the kind of faith that not only seeks to save ourselves, but to bring somebody with us. Rahab didn't just ask the spies to spare only her life, but the lives of her mother and father, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to their households. Man, I need y'all to understand. Your faith in the face of your obstacles has the potential to be the catalyst for somebody else's life change. Y'all are not getting excited with me. When you live out your faith in a way that demonstrates God's transforming power, you've got the opportunity to bring somebody with you into a new way of living. When you tell the story of how God showed up when you trusted that he would, you become the bridge for others to move from fear to faith, from belief to trust. When you're honest about your struggles, God can use your story to rewrite somebody else's. Talking about and living out our faith is in itself an act of faith because it demonstrates a confidence that faith brings change. Faith brings trust. Faith brings transformation. Faith brings endurance. Faith brings salvation. Faith brings restoration. Faith brings hope. So verse 14, the spies agreed to Rahab's request. They didn't have to, but they did. They say, our life for your lives. Rahab lets them sneak out a window in her house that's built into the wall of Jericho. And she even tells them a way to go to make sure that they don't get caught. She seems to be a better spy than either the Israelite spies or the king's men. And then as they're leaving, the spies add a disclaimer to Rahab's request, beginning in verse 17. It says, now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear, that's a whole nother sermon, but anyways. This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. And verse 21 says, agreed, she replied, let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. The spies declare to Rahab that she and her family will only be saved if they are in the house that God hands Jericho over. They are in the house when God hands Jericho over to the Israelites. And if the scarlet cord is tied to the window when they arrive. And again, if you know this story, then you know, like, yep, that's what happens. Red thread, scarlet cord, crimson rope. It's been called lots of different things in lots of different translations, but that's what happens. It has to hang out the window, and then that's what, okay, cool, got it. Okay? But this is another thing that we miss in context when we're reading an English translation. Because the word translated as cord in the NIV, and your translation may say rope or thread or possibly even line, right? But that word that the NIV translates as cord is the Hebrew word tikva, and it appears 32 other times in the Old Testament, in 31 other verses, all throughout. And each of those times, it is translated not as cord or rope or thread, but as hope or expectation. And so the spies are essentially saying to Rahab, you will be saved only if you hold on to the hope in the one in whom you've put your faith. Man, that's what living by faith means, right? You'll be saved only if you hold on to hope in the one in whom you've put your faith. And again, we read this and we know, if we know the story, we know what's coming 4 chapters later. We understand. For us, it's like 2 or 3 pages. But for Rahab, this was her life. When the spies go away, she has no idea when they're going to be back. The rest of the people of Israel haven't even crossed over the Jordan River yet. She doesn't know what the time frame is. And yet, as soon as they leave, she hangs the scarlet cord in her window. If you're familiar with the story of Jericho, even when the people of Israel arrive, they have to march around the city walls once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. And throughout all of this, Rahab would have had to hold on to hope in God that the promise of redemption would be kept. You know, as I was reading and researching this, I began to wonder if there were moments in between the spies' departure and the Israelites' first day of marching where Rahab began to wonder if they would ever even show up at all. I wonder if there were times when the people of God were seemingly inexplicably marching around the city walls where she began to wonder if her trust had been placed in the wrong place. And yet through all of that waiting and wondering, the scarlet cord, the symbol of hope, stayed tied to her window. Rahab held on to hope even when the circumstances might have seemed too much, because her faith was in the one true God. And listen, she didn't just get up every morning and look out the window and say, oh, can I see the Israelite army approaching today? That scarlet cord stayed tied there every single day. Every day she left it hanging was another act of faith. It was another proclamation of her confidence, that her confidence was in the one who promised redemption, even as the process seemed confusing or the promise seemed far off. Church, man, I came here today to tell you that holding on to hope is not just a state of being. It is a deliberate choice and a decision to act in faith that God is who he says that he is, and that he will do what he says he will do, even when the circumstances and situations might suggest otherwise. Living by faith allows us to stand up and say, despite our past and our problems, our flaws and our failures, our struggles or our situations, I believe that God can redeem my story. I believe his love for me is greater than the place I've found myself, and I am holding on to hope that he will show up and keep his promises. Man, if you think about this, in some ways, holding on to hope is a greater demonstration of faith even than stepping out and taking action, because it requires total trust and complete surrender. Man, when I step out in faith and take action, maybe I can influence the outcome even if God doesn't show up. But when I'm holding on to hope, I'm admitting that there's nothing left for me to do. It's completely out of my hands. I am utterly dependent on God to come through and bring the grace, salvation, redemption that he has promised. And so some of you today, man, you just got to hold on to hope. You got to go check the windowsill and make sure that scarlet cord is still hanging. Because I promise you that if you leave it up long enough, if you hold on tight enough, that God will show up and keep his promises. Rahab's story gets wrapped up 4 chapters later. We don't hear from her again. We hear about the movements of the people of Israel, and we're left to wonder, man, what must she be going through? How scared might she be? Because every day that cord hangs is a day that the people of Jericho might be like, hey, what's up with that cord? And every day it's another day for her to proclaim, my faith is in the one true God. But her story gets wrapped up in chapter 6, beginning in verse 22. It says, Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Verse 25 says, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. God kept his promise that Rahab and her family received the salvation and redemption that they longed for. But the phrase at the end of verse 25, it says, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. It's another powerful statement about the impact of living by faith. It's a declaration that Rahab, despite all the obstacles that made her appear irredeemable in the eyes of so many, in spite of all the things about her story that had so many people clutching their pearls, she's been made a permanent member of the family of God. Because God's grace is for everybody. And not just a member of the family, but part of the legacy of God's plan for redemption of all humanity. I know I'm jumping a lot from chapter to chapter, but I want you to look with me at Matthew chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. It's an incredibly powerful statement, even though it seems like just a bunch of names. Let's read it together. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. It didn't change up there, hold on. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Rahab became the great-great-grandmother of King David, the Israelite hero we know so much about. And even more importantly, Rahab became part of the direct family tree of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the one who came to restore and redeem all things. Rahab, the woman that everybody else wrote off or dismissed or looked down on. The person that everyone discounted or tried to clean up her story because she wasn't fit to be included in the Hall of Faith. Rahab, this woman who no one would have looked at as any form of royalty or really assigning much of any value at all outside of her profession. Rahab is in the direct bloodline of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. If that doesn't tell you that God's grace is for everybody, then I don't know another way to put it. And as you stand to your feet, we'll tie this whole story up like this. For thousands of years, theologians have seen an added layer of significance in the scarlet thread hanging from Rahab's window. She had to hold on to hope that God would keep his promises, and her symbol was a scarlet cord, a crimson thread, a crimson rope, a red thread, whatever it's called. In the same way, right? You know what else is red? The blood of Jesus. And our hope is in his sacrifice. It's in his redemption. It's in his salvation. And so not only is Rahab a direct descendant of Jesus, she's also a spiritual descendant of every single one of us. Right? Because if we're willing to live by faith, then we too can be added to the family of God forever. Because that's what faith is at its core. It's a proclamation through words and actions that Jesus is King. Salvation is here, and God's grace, love, and forgiveness is available to anyone who seeks it. Living by faith moves us to action. It makes us understand our worth in the eyes of Christ. It motivates us to hold on to hope in Jesus, and it marks us as part of the family of God forever.